I love how I chose to do this during the most stressful week. But you know what? If not now, when? So let's do it. Today I'm going to talk about an artist that I deeply admire, and I would also refer to him as a storyteller. I'm going to talk about Lee Alexander McQueen, aka the bad boy of fashion. I have always loved clothes. I've always been obsessed with clothes. As a kid, I used to spend the entire day literally drawing silhouettes and dresses. That was my favorite thing to do. And it was specifically my aunt who used to look at my drawings and tell my mom all the time that Michelle is going to become a fashion designer, or Michelle is going to study fashion design. I wish I did. Of course, it was a dream, but unfortunately, I live in a country where you have to be very pragmatic, and a lot of dreams get shut down by this question of, okay, if you study this, what are you going to do in the future? Where are you going to find a job? So that was that. But it's okay because my love for clothes is always there, and it's literally one of my favorite things in the human experience is the fact that we get to choose things and dress ourselves, or literally dress up every day of our lives. So as a kid, I used to draw clothes all the time. I used to draw my dream dresses and outfits. Also, not only did I draw dresses all the time, I would spend hours and hours trying to create clothes for my Barbies. That was also something I used to really love doing. I used to cut up my clothes, like some old clothes that my mom would allow me to cut up. And if I didn't find anything to cut up, I would literally create outfits from tissue papers. I'm serious. And when I grew up, I started really enjoying stealing my mom's old clothes, and they were my favorite clothes to wear. Her blazers, her old tops, even my dad's clothes, by the way. I think I love my dad's style even more. So I've always been obsessed with his t-shirts, his denim jackets. I think my fashion sense resembles my dad's more than my mom's. Now, I remember when I was at uni, one night I was really focused on this task of sewing a button that had fallen off one of my mom's blazers, like the buttons that you see here. And my sister sent me a message. She said, "Please, I beg you, you have to watch this documentary called McQueen. It's about the fashion designer Alexander McQueen." So I watched it, and I fell in love with this man. I fell in love with his art. I fell in love with his personality. And he became one of my main sources of inspiration in life. Now, recently, I've read two really good Alexander McQueen books. I mean, books about Alexander McQueen's. It's not like an autobiography. It was actually a biography and this beautiful coffee table book about Alexander McQueen's work that I found on Amazon. I'm really grateful that I found it. And so I combined information from research, from the books that I read and everything, and I thought I would make an episode about Lee Alexander McQueen, as an homage to him, because I admire him very much. Now, I chose this t-shirt today because I'm not someone who's really into skulls and, very gothic things, but because Alexander McQueen used to love skulls a lot, he included skulls in his design a lot, so I thought it would be perfect for the episode about him. I hope he would like it. So, Lee Alexander McQueen, the bad boy of fashion. Now, despite his relatively short career, unfortunately, I haven't mentioned it yet, but McQueen is no longer alive. We'll talk about this later. So despite his relatively short career, Lee Alexander McQueen is someone who had a lot of influence in the world of fashion. He was one of those 10 influential and avant-garde designers like Martin Margiela, Rei Kawakubo, and John Galliano. The thing about Alexander McQueen, those who really know him, they say that McQueen is someone who designed emotions. And it's something that you will get to understand as I go into this episode. So who was Alexander McQueen, and what made him special in the world of fashion? Was he a tailor? Was he an artist? Was he a storyteller? Was he someone who used fashion to process his pain? I will tell you that he was all the above. I'm gonna start at the beginning. Lee McQueen was born in London in 1969. He grew up in a working-class family. His father worked as a taxi driver in London. He was nicknamed Blue Eyes in his family because he had the bluest eyes. He is someone who always preferred drawing to studying. He was not into school at all. Even as a kid, he was someone who already understood clothing. His sister specifically remembers him constantly drawing dresses. And when he was only 17, he made a couple of skirts for his sister that fit her like a glove, as she said. They were so well fitted to her body and she would get compliments on them. Now, as a kid, Lee was also obsessed with history and storytelling because of their mom, Joyce. They say that his mom, Joyce, would had this gift of bringing the past back to life, and it felt so real that you can almost smell it. Now, as I said, Lee was not very fond of school, so he left. He didn't even graduate. He left school and he had to find a job. One evening, his mom was watching a television program and she learned how they couldn't find new apprentices to work at Savile Row. So she advised Lee to go and apply. He had nothing to lose. If they accept him, they do. If not, it's okay. And that's exactly what he did. He went and he applied. Savile Row is a very famous street in London. It is globally known as the birthplace and international gold standard of traditional men's tailoring. So there they made the best suits. They even made suits for royals. They were facing a shortage in apprentices, and they needed apprentices to teach them the craft, teach them tailoring, making suits, making jackets, and all that. Now, Lee McQueen was the best tailor who worked at Savile Row. He made the best suits, and whatever he created fit the clients again like a glove. But Lee knew from the beginning that he did not want to settle there. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life cluttered in this tiny space, sitting on a bench and just padding lapels. He had a passion. He had a passion for clothes, and apparently he was good at it. He was so good at tailoring jackets, he was so good at tailoring pants, and he was a very fast learner. He wanted to learn everything. He has this famous quote where he says, "I want to learn everything, give me everything." Now, the important thing about this Savile Row chapter of his life is that he learned how to be a good technician. He learned the craft, he learned how to tailor. See, a lot of people now remember Alexander McQueen or Lee McQueen as this showman who created these fantastical clothes, but you need to understand that before he became that, he learned how to be an amazing craftsman. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about Lee McQueen is that not only is he an amazing artist and an amazing fashion designer, but he's very hands-on. He was good at the technical aspect of his job as well. He wasn't just a designer. Backstage photographs, behind the scenes, and you always see him kneeling down or sitting on the floor just focused on sewing or fixing something or, improvising. It's very emotional. You can see his passion right there. You see when he locks in and he's just focusing on his work. He also had the skill where he was able to cut pattern directly from a piece of fabric. Now, when I say pattern, it's not like, pattern like the florals that you see here. Pattern cutting is when you cut the shape of what will become a jacket or a pair of pants. So he had the skill where he could skip a lot of those things that you usually have to do, where you have to sketch out something and then trace it on a fabric and then cut it and then sew it. He was very skilled. He could skip all these steps and just go directly to visualizing something and then cut it immediately. He was able to construct garments almost instinctively. There was always this running joke among everyone who worked with him is that he was terrifying with a pair of scissors. He was very ruthless with scissors. He always had them with him. It was the beginning of the 90s. Lee McQueen had quit working at Savile Row, and a Japanese designer, Koji Tatsuno, had opened his shop in London. Lee was interested in working with Tatsuno. So one day he just walked in, and Tatsuno said that he looked like a skinhead. I love how whoever encounters Lee, they always describe the first time they met him. They either say he's so shabby, he's so unattractive, which is a very bad thing to say. I hated when they say that. Or like he looked like a skinhead, he looked like someone who grew up on the streets or whatever. He came in and he told Tatsuno that he can cut better than a 50-year-old tailor. So Koji Tatsuno was curious and he told him, "Okay, show me what you can do." And of course, he ended up hiring him. Now, Koji Tatsuno is someone who never made clothes in a traditional way. He was very experimental. He loved experimenting with silhouette and turning a piece of fabric into a three-dimensional structure. And I think this is something that is very Japanese. You see it with Issey Miyake, and they love three-dimensional forms made from paper, made from fabric. You can also see that in the origami that they do, where literally they can turn any flat piece of paper into a three-dimensional animal, three-dimensional structure. It's very inspiring. And so Lee was very curious about that. He was very impressed with that. He wanted to understand the way Koji Tatsuno thinks and why he does what he does and why he worked this way. See, Lee was always curious about everything. So up until this point, at Savile Row, he had learned precision, he had learned the technical aspect of the job, and now with Koji Tatsuno, he learned how to view fabric in a three-dimensional way. So it was a more experimental approach that he discovered with Koji Tatsuno. And most importantly, this is where he learned that clothing goes far beyond traditional tailoring. After working with Tatsuno, he started working for a company called Red or Dead. He didn't just want to learn, he had to make money. And at Red or Dead, they were looking for technicians, people who knew the craft, people who can work the machines, pattern cutters, and of course Lee knew how to do this at this point. By the way, Red or Dead was this very youthful streetwear company, based in London, of course. They really enjoyed working with Lee. He never had an attitude, he was never late for work, he was very serious about his job, and most importantly, he knew what he was doing. They knew that he was always going to deliver. They have all these very sweet anecdotes about the time they worked with him, about how he had his Walkman on all the time, and he would listen to Sinead O'Connor all the time. He was obsessed with her before she was even that famous. Now here's an interesting story about the time Lee worked for Red or Dead. They were once working on a collection called Space Baby, and it was a collection based on the anniversary of men landing on the moon. And that time, Lee was shocked and confused. He didn't understand the connection between this historic event and a fashion collection. Alexander McQueen didn't know that you can take any topic, you can take any subject unrelated to clothing, that you can take inspiration from it and start a collection. He didn't know at the time this idea of conducting research, doing a visual research, finding a concept and building something from it. Honestly, I think this was the biggest revelation in his entire career. Because this is when he realized that, wait a minute, I can actually tell stories through the clothes that I create. And now on to the next step. He felt like he needed to move on, he needed to learn more. He was hungry for more knowledge. So he would talk to the Red or Dead designer, John McKitterick. He would ask him, what should I do next? How can I push myself forward? And McKitterick was very honest with him and told him that if you want to learn the best of the best, you're gonna have to eventually go to Italy. At the time in Italy, all designers were opening diffusion lines. And so Lee went to Italy immediately, with no knowledge of the language, with no money, with no qualifications, with nothing. Just his passion. Everyone thought that he's gonna go and he's gonna come back in a week like a failure. But a week later, almost 10 days, he calls the Red or Dead designer. He tells him that he landed a job as an assistant to the Italian designer Romeo Gigli. And everyone was shocked. Now, in case you don't know that, Romeo Gigli was one of the most admired and influential designers between the 1980s and 1990s. At that time, Romeo Gigli was very experimental. He was looking for new shapes, new designs. He wanted to create new things. And Lee, being a very curious designer to be, wanted to learn everything from him. So working for Romeo Gigli was yet another important milestone in his life, because this is where he tapped into his sensitive side. He learned romantic sensibility from Gigli. And it still wasn't enough for him. At some point he wanted to move on and he wanted to learn more. And so he goes back to London. Now Lee goes to St. Martin's School of Art, which is one of the world's most prestigious art and design schools. It was founded in 1989. You have designers like Stella McCartney, John Galliano, who graduated from it. And St. Martin's School was the most invited school to Fashion Week, London Fashion Week. So it gave its students really good opportunity. It gave them this opportunity to make connections as well. It gave them exposure. Here again, we have another person who describes their encounter with Lee McQueen, and it was the founder of St. Martin School of Art. He walks into her office with a pile of clothes, and he looked very shabby, and she didn't even know who he was. And so she asked him, sorry, can I help you? Are you looking for something? And he said, yes, I'm looking for you. He puts the pile of clothes on her desk and he says, I designed these working with Romeo Gigli and I would like to work for you. She didn't need someone to work for her. She didn't need anyone. However, she was very curious about him. He seemed like a very passionate person. And so she encouraged him to apply to study in the school. Now, Lee was very excited to be part of her course, but they couldn't really afford school at the time. But lucky enough, he had an aunt who was a single lady and she had money just sitting there in her bank account. And so she proposed to pay for his tuition. His auntie always believed that he could become a really good designer. She knew he had talent, so she was happy to support him. Now, because of his technical expertise and the years of experience that he had amassed at this point, he was able to skip his BA, his bachelor program, and he went straight into the master's. Lee was very happy at St. Martin. He said that it was the place to be. He loved the freedom of expression that it allowed him. And he used to say that he was surrounded by like-minded people. He was funny all the time. He made everyone laugh. He was so brutally honest. He had all these very inappropriate jokes. And he was very charming. But he was also a nightmare sort of student, because he was someone who knew too much, and he was never afraid to tell people that I know better than you. And, London was his town, so he knew where to go for the best of the best when it comes to fabric, material, buttons, everything. Now, one of the most important things that Lee learned being in fashion school was group work. One of the things that people tend to say a lot when it comes to McQueen is that he has a very interesting CV. To recap, first he went to Savile Row, where he learned the technical aspect of constructing clothes. And working for Koji Yakusho, he learned how to see fashion in a three-dimensional way. With Red or Dead, he learned the importance of research and the ability to tell stories through clothes. With Romeo Jiggly, he acquired the romantic sensibility to be part of this world. And with school, he got to, use all these skills that he had acquired, plus working as part of a team. So he had amassed all these really important ingredients that would allow him to become a good designer. Now, their course at St. Martin always ended with, of course, the graduation project, what we know as the graduation project, and what they call the degree show. In March 1992, which was the year I was born, Lee had his graduation project. It was a collection that he created, and the collection that he had entitled Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. When he was nearing the completion of his collection, he called the Red or Dead designer. He asked him to come and to have a look at it. Now, John McKitterick said that Lee's collection had all the elements. It had this very specific piece of history from the East End, which is, of course, the Jack the Ripper story. It had the darkness, so it had a tone. Of course, Jack the Ripper story, if you didn't know, it's a story about a serial killer who used to murder women in London. It had the research element, and all in all, it had a good story behind it. Now, the interesting thing is that at the time, Lee was reading the book Perfume, which is the story of this man who was obsessed with murdering women and creating a scent out of them, out of their skins. It's a very beautiful book, by the way. I read it and I really love it. So it was a time where he was really immersed in these dark stories, and he got inspiration from them. Now, one thing you need to understand, and it's something that I'm going to expand on later on, is that Lee already had this very deep, dark side to him. Despite the fact that, of course, he was known for being, a very funny guy, even hilarious. He was very goofy, he used to tell jokes a lot, he used to make people laugh, but he had a very, very dark side to him. So he was immersing himself in all these influences, like the stories of Jack the Ripper, Perfume. He was drawing references, and he wanted to create something beautiful out of them. The outcome was very beautiful. It was this collection of very black and red pieces of clothing. You had images pasted on fabric, and I'm sorry if this is going to sound disturbing to you, but he even had pieces of clothing that were lined with human hair. Now, during this final presentation of his collection, something very important happened, and that Lee met a person who would become a very important figure in his life, Isabella Blow. At the time, Isabella Blow was this very influential British fashion editor. She was someone who was very known for her very dramatic and eccentric style. And she had an eye for talent. She was really good at finding talented people, even fashion models. I'm going to read this quote because I really love the way Isabella Blow speaks. She's a very passionate person, and I specifically love the way she would describe everything that Alexander McQueen did. The day of his graduation project, she was there, and she said, "The pieces went past me and they moved in a way I had never seen, and I wanted them. They were modern, they were classical. You have a black coat, but then you would line it with human hair, and it was blood red inside. It was like flesh with blood." So she understood it. She really understood the intention and the story behind this collection that Alexander McQueen created. She said, "I just thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was like sabotage and tradition, which is a perfect combination. Beauty and violence. All the things that the 90s represent." Another thing that you will learn throughout this episode is that when talking about Alexander McQueen, everyone uses contrasting terms. Everything about him was about dichotomy. Until now, we have these two terms, sabotage and tradition. You have beauty and violence. You're gonna hear terms like this more and more. Now, Isabella Blow was in America when Anna Wintour discovered her. She worked for her for a while in America, and then she went to British Vogue. And there, she in turn discovered Alexander McQueen, and she decided to take him to the top. Now, after the show, she called his house, she spoke to his mother, and she told her congratulations for producing a genius. She believed that he would become the modern-day Yves Saint Laurent. She didn't call once, she kept calling. I think at some point she started calling 8-9 times a day. And so Joyce would tell her son that there's this crazy lady who keeps calling, asking for your clothes. He didn't know who Isabella Blow was, and he said that, to be honest, I couldn't care less. I just wanted the money. And she wasn't interested in him personally either. She just wanted the clothes. And so he named his price, and it was take it or leave it, and she took it all. This was at the beginning of their relationship, where they said that, I don't care who this person is, I just want their work. But in reality, they became really close friends. After the Jack the Ripper collection came the Bluebird Garage collection. And it wasn't until the Bluebird Garage collection that the St. Martin School founder thought to herself, my God, what have I unleashed into this world? It was a crazy show, and he started producing all these crazy outfits. And at the end of the show, he walked up to her and he said, I owe it all to you. She thought it was sweet and everything, but she knew that it was not true, because it was all based on his hard work and his talent. Now, Bluebird Garage was McQueen's first official professional runway show. So it was the first proper catwalk presentation, and that really helped establish his reputation as l'enfant terrible of British fashion. I'm gonna read to you the characteristics of this collection. So you had extremely low-rise trousers, and they became known as bumpsters. They were so low that you can literally, it was at the limit of the pubic bone. And it was at the limit of where you can start seeing the butt crack. You had sheer and body conscious garments. You had models that looked like they had distorted silhouettes, and that was due to his experimentation with the way he would, cut the clothing. The way he styled the clothing and the models, it suggested bruising, injuries, and vulnerability. It looked violent. Some of the shows that he created had this very obvious sense of violence. It was a dark, confrontational aesthetic that challenged the minimalist show trends in the early 90s. So he was doing something extremely unusual. Everything he was producing was no less of a shock to the people in the industry. Now I'm going to talk to you about the way Lee perceived fashion at this point and what he wanted to convey to the audience. Lee says that every fashion designer wants to create an illusion that would disturb, even fascinate people. He says that clothes are beautiful to work with, but there is reality inside. Some people don't want to hear it, thinking it's all lovey-dovey in the world outside. And I tell it the way it is. He wanted to use fashion to tell honest stories in a way, no matter how dark they were, no matter how much they would disturb the audience, which, by the way, he did not have a problem with. And this is why he was misunderstood most of the time, because he created a lot of shows that were at the time perceived to be outrageous, but became iconic with time. Now, one day he decided to officially create his first ever collection. He had expressed that to his friend and agent. Her name is Alice Smith. She was kind of shocked, because how on earth is he gonna start a business, even, a collection, when he has no money? He had nothing at the time. He had no money, no studio, no people who can be part of a team. However, he was determined, and he had his passion, which was always the strongest thing. At that point, he was literally surviving on unemployment benefits, and he used all that money to buy fabric. He was literally in survival mode. He lived on baked beans and canned soup. Now, first things first, he wanted to get a logo. His friend/agent, Alice Smith, Her boyfriend was a designer. He made the logo, but she said that it was her idea to put the C inside the Q, which became also iconic in his logo. She said that they were literally paying him to work for him at the time. He wasn't paying anyone. People were paying to work for him because this is how driven he was, and this is how much they wanted to be part of his vision and part of whatever he was trying to build. In a way, people wanted to be part of his team, cost what it may. And Isabella Blow was always determined to call him Alexander. His actual name is Lee Alexander McQueen, but she wanted to use Alexander, especially for his company name, because she thought it would sound more luxurious and more posh. At that time, they had become really good friends, and they really liked each other because they had very similar personalities, very similar unhinged personalities, very raw sense of humor. The most beautiful thing that they had in common is that they didn't care about what people thought of them. Of course, they had their differences, they had their different opinions and everything, but they loved each other very much. And at the time, Isabella Blow didn't have kids, so in a way, she mothered him. She was like this mom figure to him. Isabella also introduced him to a lot of people in the industry. What started as a work relationship became a creative friendship. She was someone who was always excited to see him create new things. She wanted to allow him this opportunity to create more and more. So she wanted to support him in any way she could. It was never really about money with her. It was more about art and creativity. And she was very honest about that. She's literally one of the most passionate people I've ever seen in the industry. Like the way she speaks, the way she dresses, the way she expresses herself about fashion. She's all about passion. As I said before, she's a very eccentric character. She lived in her own bubble. They used to say that she lived in a world that was far removed from the world that we knew. And Lee felt very much at home with her and her husband. Now, Lee had started working, he started producing more and more collections, and the clothes were getting crazier and crazier. Whatever he created was so impossible to replicate. Sometimes he would make dresses out of plastic bags, he would just cut them up and add a zipper. Sometimes he would use tape. Sometimes he would tailor a jacket and then run a truck over it with paint. And he kept producing these bumsters that became very iconic McQueen. His team would always talk about how ironic the situation was because he would create pieces of clothing that didn't cost more than 10 pounds, but they were so highly in demand and they would literally fly his collections to America on Concorde. They were not even making money at the time. It was also ironic because they were making all these clothes that were being shown in British Fashion Week and in America, and yet they were still eating from McDonald's. His partner remembers this instant where they were at McDonald's and he had dropped the food tray. They had to pick the food from the floor and eat it. He thought to himself, what a strange world we live in. We do a show in London Fashion Week and yet we are eating off the floor. And so he had to start living at some point. He had to start making money or else he could not build his company. Now, one of the most controversial and influential collections that McQueen created at the beginning of his career is known as the Highland Drape collection. It is known as the collection that transformed him from a promising London designer into a figure of international debate. It was a show where models literally would go out on stage looking like they had literally survived a traumatic event, a very violent event, like they had literally just been and survived. The runway was described as looking like a crime scene. The clothes were torn, slashed, their body parts were exposed. Models literally looked distressed and disheveled. This is where journalists and the public started building this narrative around Alexander McQueen, that Lee doesn't like women, he likes to torture them, humiliate them, watch them suffer, because of this way that women were portrayed as victims. So this show in particular, Highland Drape show, it received a lot of backlash. But he had made every single headline and he said with all honesty that he needed that. It was very important for him, even though he was thought of as a misogynistic person. So then came this very dreaded moment by a lot of artists where you have to explain yourself. He started explaining how the show was built around this idea of men wanting to take something from women and the women not wanting to give it. And there was also this other theory that the aspect of the show was not referring to men and women, but it was a portrayal of this historic event, which was the destruction and exploitation of the Scottish Highlands by England. McQueen had Scottish ancestry, and it's something that he discovered through his mom, who was obsessed with tracing back the family history and everything. So he described this collection as a response to this part of Scottish history, rather than an endorsement of violence and violence against women. In other words, he intended to portray historic trauma, survival, and resistance. I really hated the backlash that he used to get, especially when it comes to this collection, because I was one of those people who didn't see it the way other people saw it, like as this guy is a misogynistic person. He wants to humiliate women. It had an obvious theme behind it. You just have to, think deeper. Now, there's another dark secret behind the show, and I think it's the main reason behind everything that he did in every single show. You need to know that as a kid, Alexander McQueen has witnessed his sister being beaten up senseless by her husband. He witnessed that as a child, and he was never able to do anything about it. So that violence that he witnessed as a kid stayed with him, and it came out in his work. Now, another darker truth is that Lee was also sexually abused as a kid by the same person, by his sister's husband. And the sad thing is, he only told his sister 4 years before he died. It is something that he kept hidden deep within himself for the entirety of his life almost. Those dark experiences, not only did they affect his work, but they also gave him a lifetime of trust issues. He always had this unsettling sense that someone is going to screw him over. He had trust issues even when it came to the closest people to him. He also struggled with feelings of anger and vulnerability. At some point in his life, he admitted those secrets to Isabella Blow and her husband. He would explain that this part of his life made him feel hurt all the time, and he always had this feeling that he was robbed of his innocence. So those were the main reasons why Lee McQueen always had darkness, a dark side to his soul. This is why a lot of people would describe him as a not so well-adjusted person. Even though he was a romantic person, he didn't have... his relationships never lasted very long. He was also described as being a masochistic person. He was very insecure. He was almost always unhappy. He had very low self-esteem. No matter who told him he's great and people love him, people love his work, he didn't really believe that. And it didn't matter who praised him, whether it was Anna Wintour or Isabella Blow or whoever. Nothing ever compensated for his insecurities. Now, the good thing is that throughout his work, he had this ability to purge whatever was stewing inside him. Anger, rage, revenge, despair, corruption, all of it. And I think it's very beautiful how he said that he viewed his sister as vulnerable but strong. See, again, you have contrast. And he said that she became the blueprint for everything that he ever designed. This was the woman he wanted to design for, the woman he wanted to protect and empower through his clothes. I think one of the most beautiful quotes by Lee McQueen is, "I want people to be afraid of the woman that I dress." Now, we move on from the darkness a bit. There came a time where McQueen had established his name. He had his own company. He had won Designer of the Year in England twice in a row. And they wanted him to take over as creative director at Givenchy. There was a time where John Galliano had moved on from Givenchy and they wanted him at Dior. He was the creative director at Dior at the time. And so he moved with his team to Paris. Keep in mind, he was only 26 at that time. He stayed at Givenchy and worked for 5 years, almost 5 years, while keeping up with his company, of course. People were wondering, why would he leave England to go to work for another company? And as usual, he was always honest about everything. He said that McQueen is the most important thing for me. but I need the money. So whatever money I make from Givenchy, I will put back into McQueen and build up my company. He took his team, he took the jewelers, his makeup artist. It's so funny when they talk about their experience at Givenchy, because Lee McQueen and his team were so different from that vibe. We're talking about Givenchy, a very classy, very classical fashion house who dressed people like Audrey Hepburn. She was the Givenchy muse. And you had McQueen and his team who were coming from London. They looked like thugs. They were so unserious. They came in with their ripped jeans and tie-dye shirts, and they were just so different. And they came in and everyone was kneeling down and saying Monsieur McQueen, and they were laughing at that. It was not their style. In Paris, these very high brand, fashion companies, they treat the designer like a king, which is something that he didn't care much for. He wanted to be treated like a regular person. And to be honest, it was a challenge because everyone at Givenchy was also kind of uncomfortable because of the way they worked, the way they joked. It was too chaotic for them. And this is one of my favorite things about the McQueen brand, is that it is very cozy in a way. It's always been cozy, and it's always been about freedom and freedom of expression. It was not the traditional fashion house. You also had his mom. He used to have his mom backstage sometimes, and she would literally make sandwiches for everyone, and she would feed the models. She was always worried about the models. She would feed them sandwiches. It was so sweet. They didn't do this, high class bougie vibe. They didn't care much for it, even though they were, on the same level. Everyone knew that McQueen was a very unusual choice for Givenchy. People were very nervous about it. And a lot of journalists and people were against this idea of those London crazy fashion designers taking over Paris. You had Galliano taking over Dior, and you had McQueen taking over Givenchy. It was outrageous to them. And to be honest, he was also nervous because now he had this challenge of proving himself, and he had this first collection to produce in a very short period of time. But it was a very lovely, creative environment. They worked under pressure, but it was very stimulating. It was very inspiring. And of course, you had McQueen making everyone nervous with the scissors, especially at Givenchy. They were literally terrified. He would cut up everything. Everyone there was so precise, and they were so precious about everything. And you had McQueen ruthless with his scissors, chopping off fabric and doing whatever he wanted. Whenever someone would panic in front of him, he would go, "It's okay, it's only clothes." Now, of course, he built his first collection with Givenchy around one concept. They had in the atelier mood boards all around. It was heavily a teamwork, and he had his assistant, Cathy England. He used to call her the Tweedledee to my Tweedledum. They were always on the same page. They understood each other so well, and he trusted her. So it was a heavy teamwork, but Lee was always the spider at the center of the web, controlling everything, organizing everything. He was, pulling these strings and making sure that everything was working perfectly. The pressure was very high, and there were a lot of last-minute changes. He only had 25 days to create a collection completed with 55 outfits. The first collection he did with Givenchy was entitled The Search for the Golden Fleece. Lee wanted the models to look like goddesses in this collection. He wanted golden strings, gold details, gold feathers, horns on their heads. It was very eccentric and very godlike. Every single model had a different character and a different, signature style. They were also very performative. And it's also something that I really love about Alexander McQueen's work, is that the catwalk is not just a regular, you have models walking, showing the clothes and walking back out. They were so performative. I think you need to research the shows to see what I'm talking about, but they were literally like actresses. It was so beautiful. It was like you're watching theater. Now, for the collection, he got inspired quite simply from the logo, because, the G in Givenchy looks like a Greek motif. And the Givenchy label is white and gold, so this became the color palette. The collection was a bit risky, of course, because it's Lee McQueen. And unfortunately, and as usual, the press focused on the risky bits. They thought that the designs were outrageous as, being Givenchy clothes. So it goes without saying they were not very into it. At the same time, they were very scared of him. They didn't trust him as a creative director for this fashion house. But again, despite the bad reviews, he was okay with it. Of course, he himself said that I could have done much better, but he was a good fighter. He didn't want to give up. He was, looking onwards. Now, with his own personal brand, being built up, and with working for Givenchy, money started rolling in. And it was at that time where Alexander had cut off Isabella Blow. See, the thing is, he had this frustration that almost everyone thought of him as this person who made it because of Isabella Blow, because she discovered him. And that bothered him a lot. So when McQueen let go of Isabella for a while, they say that his star ascended and her star descended. People in her life were sad because they felt like Lee had abandoned her, even though they had become good friends. After that Givenchy show with the bad reviews that he got, he went back to London and he decided to create the most FU collection to the press. And so he created this collection called It's a Jungle Out There. The explanation behind it is that Lee saw the world, the human life, and specifically the fashion industry, as a place where you can easily get discarded. He felt like a gazelle in the fashion industry, and he says that the gazelle always gets eaten. And so he wanted to create a collection reflecting that, and he wanted to create the most McQueen collection he has ever done. His mindset was, F you all, I'm gonna do whatever the F I want. This is where he got back to himself. He folded this Givenchy chapter. People were going crazy to see this show. You had fashion students who were fighting their way in. He was very stressed. He was on edge, running around in backstage. He was worrying about all the details. He wanted everything to be perfect, and he wanted everything to be just the way he envisioned it to be. The models were very performative. They literally looked like creatures. They looked like animals, little monsters. The makeup, the hair, the intense smoky eyes, even their attitude. They looked like they were gonna throw themselves onto you and destroy you. And they were looking at the crowd like savages. And to make the whole thing even more dramatic, someone in the crowd had mistakenly knocked off a bucket of fire. There were buckets of fire everywhere. And there were also these very old cars as part of the show. One of the cars had caught on fire. The cars were not emptied of gas, by the way. Everyone started panicking. There was this huge fire, but Lee didn't allow anyone to stop. He wanted to go on until the end of the show. He risked everyone's life, literally. If an explosion had happened, everyone would have been history. But the show was a big success. So it was this time of his life where he was balancing work between Givenchy, between McQueen, between London and Paris. He was traveling back and forth between the two cities, and it was not easy at all. The pressure was so high, he was exhausted all the time, but the shows were so beautiful. He did different work for both houses. You had his McQueen shows were, as usual, very much him, very raw, very performative, and mostly gothic. And you had his romantic sensibility with Givenchy. Everything was softer, and it was very different. Again, you have contrasting things in his life. His runway shows were always different from anything else you would see in the fashion world. He included rainfall, artificial rainfall in his shows. It was so beautiful. But of course, the team loved McQueen the most, the house of McQueen the most, but they would describe Givenchy as a stepbrother that they loved as well. They also knew that their time with Givenchy had an expiration date. They were just there for a while, so this is why they gave all their love and attention for McQueen. It was their baby. It was his baby. He also wanted to be different with everything that he did. He didn't like to be compared with anyone. They would usually compare him to John Galliano, which also bothered him, even though he admired him. Galliano's work is work that he admired, but he didn't want to be like anyone. He didn't want to be labeled as, he reminds me of this guy or that guy. He didn't want to resemble anyone in his work. He wanted to be his own thing. Now, new ideas started boiling in his head for his next collection with McQueen. He had this new idea, an idea that included robots, and the team was nervous because whenever he brings up robots, everyone goes like, oh my god, there he goes again with robots. They always hope that he would, forget about it at some point. But he always had very clear visions in his head. He knew what he was talking about. He believed that it would work. And it was actually a success, and he surprised everyone. It was one of the most beautiful McQueen shows, and one of the most iconic ones as well. He did this show, I remember by the way, with each and every one of McQueen shows, I wish when he was alive, I wish I was there. This is a frustration within me. Because I think it's his shows are something very beautiful that you can possibly witness in person. So for this show, the catwalk was like a huge, vast room. The flooring was wooden. You had a model walking out with this poofy, delicate white dress. And then she stands on a rotating platform. She starts rotating, and then robots surround her and they start painting the white dress in real time. And it was so beautiful. He said that it was the first time he was blown away by his own show. He was becoming more and more famous with time. People were recognizing him everywhere. He was chased around, photographed everywhere, started making more and more money. But unfortunately, the more money he made, the more unhappy he became. Because with money came the drugs, and the pressure was, increasing as well. He had more anger issues, he was more paranoid, he changed in many ways. His romantic life was also not going so well. He never achieved the love that he always dreamed to have. And of course, with his trust issues, that made him suffer even more. He also had surgery, his looks changed a lot, and some people say that his personality changed after he got the surgery. He was quieter, he kept to himself. He definitely became more introverted. In the last few years, he would only be able to handle a few people in his life. He had a very small circle. The team said that it was such a sad time, such a dark time, that they didn't enjoy being around him, or they didn't enjoy the work as much. And those were very dark times. And even when the people that he was very close to, people who he spent years working with, people who were part of his team from the beginning, whenever, due to the work and them being unhappy with the work, whenever they would come up to him and say like they were thinking about leaving, he would get really upset and he would say, "Go, fuck it, I don't even care, go." It was so easy for him to, discard people who he used to love. But, despite the darkness, despite the pressure, despite everything, the shows were becoming more and more beautiful and impressive. Now, again, one of his most famous and iconic shows was entitled Voss. And the original concept for Voss was a padded cell. And padded cell equals insane asylum. Voss is actually considered a masterpiece, an Alexander McQueen masterpiece. I remember the first time I watched the show in the documentary, it gave me chills. So if Highland Drape in the past made him infamous, Voss has established him as one of fashion's greatest theatrical storytellers. The show explored themes of beauty, madness, voyeurism. He wanted to express this idea of how the fashion industry judges bodies and people's appearances. With this show, McQueen wanted to challenge this idea of conventional beauty. He wanted to force the audience to examine their own reaction, their own role as spectators. The collection was a mixture of classical tailoring, classical and wearable tailoring, with very unsettling pieces. You literally had garments made from razor clamshells. You had seashells, you had bird feathers, antique textiles, even taxidermy details. Models, he had them wear, bandages around their head, and they were instructed to appear mad, distressed, and unstable. So, to reinforce this insane asylum theme. One of the most famous garments was this dress made from clamshells, and it rattled as she walked, and it also broke. It was so beautiful because there was no music. It was very eerie, and you can hear screams, you can hear the garments move, the material being torn. Because they were, instructed to look mad, so they would sometimes start tearing their dresses and throwing pieces on the ground. It was so, so beautiful. And Lee had this image of this huge glass box in the middle of the runway, and he wanted to reveal what's inside the box as the climax of the show, at the end of the show. So after the final look, you have the four sides of the box, they come down slowly and then they shatter. When the box breaks, it reveals writer and artist Michelle Olay. She is lounging on a sofa. She is completely nude, and she has on this mask, and she is surrounded by moth flying all around her. The image is a reference to Sanitarium, which is a photograph by Joel Peter Whitkin. It was described as this gruesome image that no one was expecting. By creating this show, he wanted to give fashion its worst nightmare. No one was ready for it. The set was so beautiful. There was glass around the catwalk. Models were not able to see the audience. What was reflected to them was their own image. They described the whole set as something out of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey meets Insane Asylum. It was a very psychological show. It's something that stayed with people for a very long time, and now, of course, it's considered as a masterpiece in fashion. It is something that I completely adore about Alexander McQueen, is that he saw the beauty in the unusual. Now, I just want to talk about Voss itself. Now, Voss, the title Voss is generally understood to come from the Norwegian district of Voss. It is a region known for its wildlife and natural landscapes. Nature was actually a major theme throughout Alexander McQueen's career. And in Voss, the garments incorporated shells, feathers, taxidermy birds, and other natural material, and the show explored the relationship between human body and the natural world. Now, Tom Ford, who was a god at the time, expressed his jealousy of Alexander McQueen. He said that he was so jealous of his genius. And the reason why he considered him to be a genius is because he is someone who was at the same time poet and commerce. He expressed himself very artistically. He was like an artist. And at the same time, he was able to create something that you can hang in a store and have people buy and wear. Now, after Givenchy, Gucci wanted him. At this point, Lee did not care about the money. He cared about the freedom. He wanted to be left alone. He didn't want to be controlled. He didn't want anyone telling him what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So he had to say goodbye to Givenchy at some point. And then it was McQueen and Gucci. He was busy and the work was great as usual, but Lee was also very tired. And one of the best ways for him to unwind and to, take a step back was reconnecting with nature. He had his beloved dogs. They were his favorite thing in the whole world. His family, his mom, his sister. He had this small cottage house he would go back to. And in front of the house, he had this very beautiful big tree, which he lit up from the bottom. It used to give him a lot of inspiration. He used to look at it at night. As a matter of fact, he used it for inspiration in one of his shows. He had this very big lit up structure at the center of the runway show. Another memorable show that McQueen did later on in his career was entitled Windows of Culloden. The most beautiful part of this show was the ending, where he had Kate Moss appearing as a hologram, and she was floating around in a dress. Everything that Lee expressed was deeply personal. Everything was about his psyche. Everything was about his emotions, his experience. He said that even turning Kate Moss into a hologram at the end of my show, it's a very heavenly and very ethereal image. And to him, it is a representation of this feeling he has sometimes where he feels one with the world. This is why McQueen used to say, if you want to know me, look at my work. Now, when Isabella Blow died, a lot of things changed in Alexander McQueen's life. It was literally one of the most devastating things that he had to go through. Despite the friction that happened at some point, they had unconditional love for each other. They had a real friendship. She was like a sister, like a mother, like a best friend to him. She was also a muse. They also had a lot in common. They had this sadness and destructive side to them. She was very sick, and at some point she decided to end it all. McQueen dedicated a show to Isabella. It was entitled La Dame Bleue. People who went to the show said that you can feel her presence everywhere. You can see her everywhere. You can even smell her. The clothes were so beautiful, eccentric, and they resembled every aspect of her life. There were also bird-related things, because it was also a passion that they shared together. They used to fly falcons together. It was so adorable. At the end of the show, he came out wearing a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt. Isabella Blow passed away, and McQueen was officially in a dark place. The shows continued. Another noteworthy show that he created was The Horn of Plenty, and it was a savage satire on the fashion industry. especially when it comes to waste. It was about overconsumption. The set featured a huge pile of trash-like objects. There were even recycled objects from his past shows, and I love that. And as usual, the models wore highly dramatic pieces. There were pieces inspired by 1950s haute couture, but they were distorted and exaggerated. Accessories were intentionally shocking as well. Cans, umbrellas, plastic, debris, makeup was exaggerated, looked terrifying. Everything was styled in a way that felt glamorous and grotesque at the same time. Again, you have contrast. The title is a reference to this historic object like the cornucopia, the horn-looking thing that they used to stack fruit and objects in. McQueen took this idea and twisted it into something darker, suggesting fashion's abundance and wasteful products. See, his shows were always so intellectually layered. You go there and you start by feeling nervous. You wonder what he's gonna convey this time. When I think about it, it makes so much sense that as a student, he used to go to fashion shows, and even if he went to a Givenchy show or these very high brand shows, he would sometimes say that they're completely rubbish, they're trash. Because to him, it's boring to just create a floral dress that says nothing. It didn't mean much to him. He wanted emotions. He wanted to make you think. He wanted to disturb you. Now, in the mid-2000s, Lee was not well at all. He was working a lot, but he was also fighting AIDS. He was diagnosed with AIDS. He never stopped working. Now he was designing for men as well, so he was expanding in a way. And he was producing, and while working with Gucci as well, he was producing 14 collections a year. His family would tell him, you need to take a step back. You don't have to work anymore. It's fine. But he never did stop, because he said that a lot of people are dependent on me. A lot of people are paying their mortgages because they work at McQueen. If I stop everything, I will ruin a lot of people's lives. It's so sweet. He felt responsible for the people he was, the people who were working for him. And every show that he created was personal. So he's not gonna just hand out his company to someone else. As much as he wanted to leave everything behind and rest, the paranoia was getting worse and worse. He was always paranoid about people following him. He was not very stable. And now we reach the final show that Alexander McQueen created, and it was entitled Plato's Atlantis. Like I said before, nature is very important to Alexander McQueen, and nature was a recurring theme. But specifically water. Water was very important to Lee. The idea of Plato's Atlantis was people coming from the land and going into the sea. Now the core idea is showing a future where global warming is gonna melt all the ice, sea levels will rise, and it will flood the earth. Humans are forced to evolve into aquatic creatures and survive underwater. McQueen used the myth of Atlantis as described by Plato. He used this myth as a framework for his idea of collapse and adaptation. Contrast again. He loved the sea, he loved swimming, he loved scuba diving, this feeling of escapism and being in a different world underwater. It was almost like being back in the womb floating. The image or the idea of water gave him a lot of serenity. Water, deep water is perceived by many cultures as a place of darkness, but also a source of life. And to quote McQueen himself, he says, "Sometimes I feel like I am drowning. But then again, I've always felt peace and quiet under the ocean with me, myself, and I." I love the fact that his final show was very much related to this theme of water. And what's very special about Plato's Atlantis is that it was completely new. He didn't want to take a reference or inspiration from anything related to clothes. The main inspiration was nature itself. You had entire mood boards filled with fish details, gills, snakes, seaweed, shipwrecks. He also had this image in his head of digital elements. He also wanted to incorporate technology, robotics again. Plato's Atlantis turned out to be an exceptionally innovative collection. They even used softwares at the time that were relatively new. They used softwares to, mirror patterns. They used stuff like Photoshop, but at the time it was very new. The garments were very complex to create. All in all, Plato's Atlantis had 45 different outfits. In the show, you also had this contrast of the machinery and technology, the beauty and fragility of nature. It was so typical McQueen. The rough and the gentle together. You had the classic and the modern together. Women literally looked like hybrid creatures. They looked like aliens. So it was aliens, technology, nature all together. McQueen wanted to do something revolutionary, and with Plato's Atlantis, he was able to achieve that. There are pieces that have become iconic. For example, I think most of us know the armadillo boots. They were made famous by Lady Gaga as well. Those boots were designed for Plato's Atlantis specifically, for example. Now, despite the success, despite the excitement of working on the collection, everything on the personal side was going further and further downhill. While designing the last collection, he would, say in passing that this is gonna be my last collection. I'm gonna myself afterwards. I am done with all this shit. I wanna end it. He said that just like with Voss, I wanna come out in this glass box. As soon as it opens at the end of the show, I'm gonna... See, the thing is, he's always had this very morbid sense of humor, and people around him were used to it, but somehow this time it felt a bit off. His friends didn't know what to say at this point. Lee used to describe his life as being like a roller coaster. There were all these very high ups and very low downs. He wanted to stop it. He wanted to get off this roller coaster. Despite the fact that he was very successful, very, very loved, he always felt that the fashion industry was against him. His team would tell him, you need to stop being negative. You need to stop thinking like that. People love coming to your shows. They come to see your work. They come to see you. They love what you produce. He did not believe them. And then something extremely sad and dreadful happened to him, which pushed him over the edge. Now, the thing is, at the time, and what added to his sadness and what added to his darkness is the fact that his mom was very sick. And Lee McQueen loved his mom so much. She's always been this very important part of his life. She always supported him. Ever since he was a kid, she always made him feel that he could accomplish anything. So part of him having this confidence to apply for things, to push himself, to want to learn more, it was partly due to his mom, because she pushed him. She made him believe that you can do whatever you want. So he owed a lot to her. She's always been his support, his favorite person, his favorite storyteller. And after her death, he was completely unwell. He was in a completely bad shape. He idolized his mother and she had left him. He wanted to give her a proper send-off. He wanted to say goodbye to her beautifully by asking his nephew to help him design her gravestone, which was very beautiful. It was like an angel wrapping his wings around her. And he wanted the hand specifically to be facing up. The last ever conversation he had with his sister was about his mom. Now, the very sad thing is that on the eve of his mom's funeral, Lee Alexander McQueen chose to end his life. It was Feb 11, 2010. Lee was someone who was very much about love and connection in his life. He didn't really care about anything else. He had this passion that he poured his soul, his psyche, all his emotions into. A lot of the things that he created were dedicated to his loved ones. So at the end of the day, it was always about his loved ones. He started crumbling down after having lost Isabella, and after losing his mom, he didn't have much to be happy about anymore. After Lee's death, the fashion world was in shock. Everyone mourned him. Everyone was sad about him. What is very touching is that even his funeral was described as having a lot of dichotomy in it. He had his fashion people and he had his family who didn't understand this world at all. It was, again, his life was all about contrast. It was all about very different things coming together. So yeah, unfortunately, Lee's death was very untimely. It was very sad. He was still young, in his early 40s. Lee was this sensitive visionary who reinvented fashion in so many ways. He wanted to make beautiful things. He literally sculpted beauty. And I love whenever someone says that McQueen created very feminine, beautiful clothes that say, don't fuck with me. And it was especially Isabella Blow who used to say that no one designed emotion like McQueen. The beauty that Lee McQueen created was savage. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous fashion exhibitions that was created in dedication to his work was entitled Savage Beauty. They first opened it in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and then they did a version in New York. Lee McQueen was someone who was very driven by his passion and by his need to tell stories. He was also dubbed as a master of polarities. Just like I told you that he was all about contrast and paradox. As a matter of fact, I collected all the phrases that I was able to collect from reading about Alexander McQueen. You have Lee wanted to turn ugly into something beautiful. You have tradition and destruction, dark and light, nature and technology, soft dresses and robotics, beauty and tragedy, elegance and violence, tradition and rebellion, crude and sophisticated, macabre and poetic, and there's so much more. Even Lee himself used to say that I oscillate between life and death, happiness and sadness, good and evil. I personally am someone who loves contrast. And Lee McQueen is someone who was able to visualize that and express that so effectively and beautifully. Learning about McQueen, I also loved seeing how someone can use their artistry as exorcism, literally. He used fashion as a means to express the things that were too difficult for him to articulate, even dark secrets that he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. The collections that he created were not simple trends. They were literally emotional diaries. He himself says that his work is a biography of his personality. And one of my very favorite things about Alexander McQueen is that he was someone who embraced all his interests. He is someone who knew how to express his love for film, photography, books, nature. He knew how to take inspiration from all his interests and do something about it. He is someone who makes me adore visual research before taking on any project. As a matter of fact, I did use Alexander McQueen as an example in one of my classes to teach my students about the importance of visual research and grabbing inspiration from anywhere. This is what they refer to as cross-pollination. You literally take inspiration from a movie to create, I don't know, a poster. You can take inspiration from an architectural detail to create a bag. And a lot of good designers used to do that. Whenever I feel lost when it comes to building a concept or coming up with an idea, I always think about Alexander McQueen. Another thing that I learned about Alexander McQueen and that I think makes him very special is the way he viewed the body. His view of the body was very particular. As a matter of fact, his sketches are very different from other fashion designer sketches. The way he drew the silhouette was very specific. He always focused on the side view because it made the garments look more beautiful. He had a love for crinoline and long dresses and capes. And so drawing a silhouette from a side view emphasized the beauty of those garments. His drawings showed a deep understanding of the skeletal figure. He loved experimenting with clothes. I mean, a lot of people used to judge his bumpsters, as I told you, like the very, very low-rise pants that he used to create. But the secret behind them was not just, to show the body in a very sexy way. It was not that. It was mainly the fact that he loved experimenting with changing the way the body looks based on how you design clothes. For example, by lowering the pants to this extent, you are able to create this illusion that the torso is so long. He used to elongate the body in very magical ways. And of course, one of the reasons why he used to lower, the pants line is because to him, he thinks that the bottom of the spine is the sexiest zone when it comes to either men or women. Again, they used to judge him for that. But I mean, if you watch the new season of Euphoria, and if you saw the beautiful dress that the character of Maddie Perez wears to Cassie's wedding, you will see how they emphasized this very low, dress line. As soon as I saw the scene, I immediately got the sense that McQueen must have been the inspiration behind that. Now, Gothic sensibility is also something that I want to talk about at the end of this episode. I feel like McQueen is one of those people who really knew how to work the Gothic theme. Gothic romanticism. He was very reminiscent of Edgar Allan Poe poetry, Victorian dresses, Tim Burton aesthetic. They used to refer to him as Edward Scissorhands, by the way. And this Miss Havisham imagery. these details in his shows might have been disturbing to a lot of people. And to be honest, they are not very easy to stomach. But the beautiful thing is that they are all based on history. And it's also something that I discovered through my reads. And I loved learning about those things. He was seriously obsessed for the longest period of time with the Jack the Ripper story, to the point where he used to tell his classmates that he was related to him. And after having watched The Silence of the Lambs, it also inspired him a lot. I know what I'm saying is very disturbing, but I mean, to each their source of inspiration. He was very fixated on the character of Buffalo Bill, a psychopath tailor who used to create fashion objects or things out of women's skins. He also got inspired by this idea of moths and butterflies being encased into fabric. He also once did a dress with rose petals encased into fabric. It was so beautiful. And as a student, he had this book of Victorian fashion. It was always under his desk. It became a book that he referenced a lot. Now, my favorite thing was actually reading about the reason why he liked to incorporate hair in his clothing. Now I'm going to read it to you, and it's something that I took from the book. So the inspiration behind the hair came from Victorian times, when prostitutes would sell theirs for kits of hair locks, which were bought by people to give to their loved ones. And he himself used it as a signature label, with locks of hair, being incorporated in his clothing. And in the early collections, it was his own hair. And in a way, it was about him giving himself to his collection. McQueen had named his collection Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. On one level, he cast himself as a kind of stylistic serial killer, slashing and cutting up clothes to refashion the female silhouette into a form that was more aesthetically pleasing. But the incorporation of his own hair into the clothes also symbolized his emotional identification with his victims. There was something sweetly romantic about the gesture too. As McQueen stated, in Victorian times, prostitutes would sell their locks out of economic necessity to people who then gave the hair as tokens of affection. McQueen had a hope that the same narrative of romance would infuse his own life, and that he could move away from the ugly realities of exploitation and abuse to something sweeter and gentler, more equal. To him, this talisman of lock of hair sewn into his clothes meant that he believed in the possibility that one day he would be transformed by the power of love. McQueen wasn't interested in darkness for shock value. He was more interested in the truth hidden inside the darkness. McQueen was someone who was not simply creating fashion shows. He was creating immersive artworks. This is why when talking about Alexander McQueen, they refer to him as an artist. He had the soul of an artist, not just, he's just a fashion designer. Today, McQueen's work still resonates, not just because the clothes were beautiful, but because they carried something unmistakably human. They conveyed fear, they conveyed desire, pain, wonder, love. So above all, they conveyed emotion. McQueen was someone who believed that if the audience left having felt nothing, or just like, yeah, that was a pretty dress, he believed that that was a sign of failure. Now, the reason why I am grateful for having read the biography and the Alexander McQueen coffee table book is because I learned so many intricate details about the fashion world and about his sources of inspiration. The book gave me so much. It relatively took me a long time to read because I had to stop at many occasions to pick up some names and do extensive research about whatever I just read. There were mentions of Elsa Schiaparelli, even the backstory of Isabella Blow was very interesting, and Le Marquis de Sade, all these people who inspired McQueen a lot. So I did some research on these people, and it helped me understand his work even more. For example, I learned that Le Marquis de Sade was a French aristocrat and philosopher and writer whose work explored themes of sexuality, power, violence, freedom, and morality. De Sade is significant not only because of the explicit nature of his writing, but also because he challenged those ideas. To a lot of people, it may seem outrageous, the things that he would talk about or his philosophies. But to people like McQueen, it was pure inspiration. So what Lee had in common with him was seeing the beauty in the violence, this paradox. And of course, challenging social boundaries. No one excelled at that more than McQueen in the fashion world. They had this love and appreciation for theatrical darkness and psychological drama. I also want to tell you something about something I discovered about Isabella Blow, because I wanted to understand more. Why do they always talk about them, like Isabella Blow and Alexander McQueen, as having a lot in common when it comes to a dark past and sadness? As it turns out, there's this incident that happened to Isabella Blow when she was a kid, and it was seriously very traumatic. She was a kid. I think she was no more than 5 years old. Her mom wanted to go inside the house, so she told her to watch over her baby brother. When she was watching over him, she got distracted by something, so her brother swallowed something and he choked and he fell from the balcony and died. It was something like that, and it was such a dark story, such a traumatic event in her life. And so Isabella Blow has always lived with the sense of guilt. She believes that she was the reason why her baby brother died. And I also learned about why she always has dark lipstick on. She said that that day when her mom went back to the house, it was because she wanted to apply lipstick, red lipstick, and this is why she has this obsession with lipstick. And Isabella Blow was someone who was very insecure about her looks. It was also something that she shared with Alexander McQueen. This is why she loved to cover herself up a lot with her dramatic fashion. And she was always uncomfortable with her teeth. Around the time where she decided to go fix her teeth, it was too late. This is why there was the signature thing with Isabella Blow, is that she always has lipstick on her teeth, because her teeth were very like... And the last story I want to give you from the book is something that also made me emotional. And it was a story of Elsa Schiaparelli. Elsa Schiaparelli was an Italian haute couture designer. She became one of the most important, influential and experimental figures in the 20th century fashion scene. She is someone who was known for blending fashion and surrealist art, which is why she worked with artists like Salvador Dali. Now, the story of Schiaparelli that I learned is that as a kid, her mom used to judge her looks a lot, which I think is very messed up, to say the least. So she grew up feeling very insecure about herself. But yeah, as a kid, she wanted to feel more beautiful and please her mom, to the point where she had this idea to take flower seeds and shove them and put them inside her ears, her nose, and swallow them. She believed that maybe with the temperature of her body and by drinking water, those seeds would bloom and she would become beautiful, because flowers would come out of every hole in her face. And of course, she almost died doing that as a baby, as a kid. When McQueen learned about this story, he loved it. It became very inspiring to him, especially because, again, as I told you, he was someone who was insecure about his looks a lot as well. And so this Elsa Schiaparelli story, it became inspiration to him in his runway shows. This is why you would see models with very eccentric looks and feathers. Sometimes they would have horns on them, florals, butterflies, all these objects around them. It was like a nod to Elsa Schiaparelli and this idea of, beautifying something by using elements of nature. And I love this story. There were so many stories that I wanted to tell in this video, but it was way too many stories, and I had to, make it a bit more compact. And then I thought to myself that if you're interested, maybe you will read the book and you will learn more and more about Alexander McQueen. And also, to be honest, there are so many stories and anecdotes that I can't even say here on YouTube, because, oh my god, he was wild. So yeah, now I'm gonna end it with a quote. McQueen says, "I didn't care about what people thought of me. I didn't care what I thought of myself. So I would go to the far reaches of my dark side and pull these horrors out of my soul and put them on the catwalk." He is someone who meant every word he said, and he is someone who practiced what he preached. That's it for episode 8. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. And